I filled a strange slot because I'm probably the only person who came out of the straight press and went into the underground press. My background was on two enormous circulation papers, a wire service and the New York Times, and then the Village Voice, and then tiny little underground papers. I became radical because I joined the underground press, not the other way around. I began to share the vision that all of them had. I began to see that the things they said were wrong, and to promote them and to fight for them.
Hello and welcome to Artifacts, a living archive dedicated to preserving the first-person stories of queer, avant-garde, and underground culture, told by those who lived it. Today's episode is part of our series Underground Press, the untold stories of literary rebellion and the figures who redefined the boundaries of literature and publishing. This episode features John Wilcock, British-born journalist and co-founder of the Village Voice. A fixture of New York bohemia, Wilcock went on to write for the East Village Other, publish one of the earliest books of interviews from Andy Warhol's factory, and serve as the first publisher of Andy Warhol's Interview magazine. As a co-founder of the Underground Press Syndicate, his work helped connect alternative publications across the U.S. and beyond.
John Wilcock, born in the north of England, Sheffield in Yorkshire. I was a dedicated writer from before I even knew what it was all about. I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. It never occurred to me to think of having a career or anything. I just used to write all the time. When I was at boarding school, I was already writing little magazines and passing them around during the homework period, you know.
Describe them.
Well, they were little tiny things, and they were very much like what I'm still doing, which is to take an 8.5 by 11 page and fold it until it's like this little mini magazine. This one happens to be about Marilyn Monroe, whom I interviewed in the 50s. And I used to scribble them at school and pass them back to my, friends who were doing their homework. And so when I left school, the first thing they did was my parents got me a job on the local paper, which happened to be Sheffield. Once you start on a newspaper, I think it benefits everybody to work for a newspaper because you get edited. And I never met a writer in my life that wasn't improved by editing. You got to learn to be edited. So I learned to be disciplined. I learned to collect facts and to present them in an interesting manner. And I think the best training I ever had was by the time I had done a few years in other jobs like the Daily Mail and so on, I went to work for the London Daily Mirror, which at the time was a 5 million circulation tabloid. And although sensational, not sensational in the Murdoch way. I mean, they used to take serious issues like government white papers and present them so that the public could understand them. And in those days, a tabloid in England dealt with serious issues in a tabloid manner, which is rarely done now. People associate tabloids with suspect, overwrought, hysterical manner. But in actual fact, a good tabloid takes a story, cuts it to its essence, and gives it an interesting intro to get the reader into it, and also presents it with reverse bendays and shadows and silhouettes, pictures and large headlines and tricky things, so that it's irresistibly drawn to read these stories. That we were taught, when I worked on a tabloid, that the first sentence was really important. Get the reader into the story was the injunction. So that was how I learned to write the way I've written ever since. I try to be interesting. It's never far from my mind, after being 50 years or more as a writer, it's never far from my mind is this interesting? Well, back in the days of probably the 17th or 18th century, there were no real shops in England, although in the villages there might have been something that passed for shops, but an awful lot of England obviously was rural with widely separated farms. And the way people got their goods were the traveling peddlers who used to travel around the countryside with a sack on their back, and in the sack were all household goods like needle and thread and thimbles and things that you use around the house, and maybe pots and pans. And they nearly always carried one little publication, which was a chapbook. and usually sold for, I don't know, a fraction of a penny probably. But since they were only reading the was, when the peddler came round, people bought the thimbles and stuff, and they also bought a chapbook. Chapbooks were everything. They were maybe reprints of a bit of Daniel Defoe, or a bit of Shakespeare, or a bit of the Bible, or some kind of a tract. But the best sellers were reports of the executions at Tyburn, the hangings, which were public and got large crowds, as they would today. And so those were best sellers. And that was the beginning of small-time publishing. And the only other publishing at the time would be post-Chaucer, the actual small number of people who were producing books on a small scale for the gentry. And preceding those were the hand-drawn, almost Bible-type things done by the monks in the abbeys and stuff. So that's where publishing sort of began. And so flash to the present day America, and we're now talking about the 1930s or so. And there was a guy called E. Julius Haldeman, and he is little known today, but during his day he used to produce hundreds of millions of booklets which were sort of square. In other words, you fold the page twice and you have a kind of a little square booklet, and these were called Little Blue Books, and they sold for a nickel. And what he did first was to reproduce basically everything, all of Shakespeare, all of Dickens, everything there was, and just reproduce them and sell them as 5-cent books, and put out catalogs which had listed hundreds of things. And some were sex titles, and some were philosophical, and some were instructional. And there's a funny story about Haldeman that it's not quite true, but they say they made his money because among the hundreds of titles, he had maybe about 3 or 4 titles about sex. And when people used to send in the nickels for these books, they were embarrassed to just ask for the sex title, so they would order 4 or 5 others and send him a quarter, you see, to disguise the fact they were sending him for a sex book. Anyway, he was a guy who did a free-thinking newspaper down in Kansas, which was basically the anarchistic, underground, anti-establishment, realistic, querying the establishment and the Catholic Church thing of its day, very skeptical about everything, but free thinking, I mean, basically theoretically neutral. And he got the opportunity to buy this press, realized that he could produce something like the Little Blue Books relatively cheaply by the thousand, and started this series, which eventually went into hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of titles. Well, I had a trial period at the New York Daily Mirror when I first went to New York, where Winchell was still the king. And he was more than anybody else responsible for the notion that you could cut things down to a very, very brief statement, sometimes using funny words and strange punctuation, and string it together with a whole bunch of other stuff. And it would be fascinating to read. And what I tell people is, I said, when I try to write my column like that, it seems like a lot of items just thrown together, but in actual fact it's very carefully choreographed. I've done 1,000 columns now, and every one of those columns I've worked out where things are going to be placed. And the ideal is you grab somebody and you pull them into this boat and you start down these whitewater rapids, and there are flat periods and sudden drops, and then flat periods and so on. And so a column, it works in such a manner that there's no, once you get in, there's no way you can get out of it. You have to absolutely read it to the end. It's compulsive, because everything is short and leads to something else. And so what follows is sometimes totally different. For example, you can get away with it very inflammatory things by sandwiching between 2 items that are very bland. You can put what I term time bombs in by very brief pieces of information that seem to have no meaning or information whatsoever, except the fact that they're there. Like, for example, acid rain was something I ran. A long time ago I saw it spelled out on somebody's refrigerator, acid rain. I said, what on earth is acid rain? So the guy goes into this big rap. Nobody had ever heard of acid rain at the time. We did long afterwards. So acid rain is an ideal time bomb. You drop it in the column between 2 informative pieces. People don't realize they've seen it until somehow they see acid rain again somewhere else, And as my friend Stan says, the third time they see that, it's like a neon sign from God. The first thing I did when I went to New York was to realize that the local paper in Greenwich Village, which had always been my idol to live in Greenwich Village, where all the artists and writers and so on were, the only thing there was a local paper that was full of tea parties and a column done by a cat called Scoopy Muse, and it was real cornball stuff. And what I had done was I had put up a notice in a bookstore in Sheridan Square saying, is anybody interested in starting another newspaper apart from the Villager? And among the people that responded were Dan Wolfe and Ed Fancher, and they had plans of their own to start a paper, but they didn't have any money. And a year later, I ran into them again. In the meantime, we made no progress. I ran into them again in Julius's, a now defunct bar, and they had Ed's telephone stock, Orange County telephone stock money, and they were going to start a paper, which at the time was unnamed. And Dan Wolfe was going out with a woman called Rhoda, whose friend was Norma Mailer. And so he was brought in on the early things. And then Jerry Tolmer, who was, I think, doing theater reviews for The Nation or something like that. And they decided they wanted to start this paper, and they had the money to do it. I think they had $14,000. And we took an office above Sutter's at the bottom of Greenwich Avenue, next to the Women's House of Detention there, and pulled in the furniture and started to put out the Village Voice. From the very beginning, it started to run stuff that nobody else ran. It started reviewing off-Broadway theater. Jerry Tolmer introduced something called the Obies, which were the awards for off-Broadway theater, and it started reviewing books and film, and it started running stuff by Jane Jacobs, and it started running stuff about the move by the Village Independent Democrats to unseat DeSapio, Carmine DeSapio, and to talk about the evils of Robert Moses, how it was wrecking places and stuff like that. And it was political, and yet it was also literate and artistic. And of course, it was soon getting contributions from all kinds of people who wanted to write for it or be in it in some way or other. I discovered that one of the interesting things about starting a new paper, it's like starting a bus line. As soon as you start running regular routes, everybody wants to come on the bus. Norman started doing a column from the first few issues, and they were very arrogant and very egotistical, although I must say quite interesting, and brought in a lot of inflammatory mail, which might have been the intention. He was very fond of himself, and he used to get very riled about, for example, once he had a big fight because a typo had used the word nuisances when he had said nuances. And he had a big battle over that. And he was always hammer and tongs with Ed and Dan. And in retrospect, he and I should have been allies. But in actual fact, he hated me too, partly because I was news editor and basically had some control over what he wrote and where it went. Not to the extent of taking it out, but he didn't regard anybody as being as clever as he was, and certainly not as good, and certainly not as well known a writer, which is absolutely true. It was a name. He was a best-selling novelist very young, and started to feel that as soon as he was paid $1 a word, or probably a lot more now, that who would dare to cut any of his stuff, And he would. Mailer's a very interesting thinker, but unfortunately he's one of these people that just rambles and rambles and rambles, And as an editor, I could take Mailer's stuff, and it sounds arrogant, but any editor could take Mailer's stuff and cut it and improve it. And so a constant battle went on between Norman and Danny and Ed, and a constant battle went on between Danny and Ed and me, because they were basically, in retrospect, The Voice appears to have been a revolutionary, radical paper. In actual fact, it was really quite mainstream. It was just very different because nobody had done an alternative paper before. But they were quite conventional people. And, for example, I once wrote about the Jehovah's Witnesses, their idea of door-stopping you, and they get your attention with this beautiful girl, and then all of a sudden somebody steps out with a Bible and stuff. So I wrote about that, and they wouldn't run that column. They thought it was offensive. And then I did a column about how bidets, B-I-D-E-T, bidets were becoming popular, and they wouldn't run, for an import from Europe, they wouldn't run that because it was in bad taste. And I offered Paul Krasner my 100th column as an anniversary column, and they wouldn't run it because they thought Krasner was too far out. I had run Bill Beckman's cartoon, a strip cartoon called Captain High, about an early dope pioneer. And Ed became aware that I was a dope smoker and became very alarmed and refused to allow me to get any mail at The Voice in future in case somebody was sending me dope. And I started to talk about Ed Sanders, who was running the Peace-Eye bookstore, and he had a magazine called Fuck You, which they wouldn't run. They would F star 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 you. And Danny would accuse me always of why was I always writing about my friends? And I said, well, they weren't my friends when I wrote about them. They became my friends after I wrote about them, you know. So they were very much at odds with me. And if you read that book, The Great American Newspaper by Kent McDougall, I think, did a book about the story of the Village Voice. It comes through quite clearly in that book that they hated my guts. Ed was very aloof and intimidating to the extent he'd call me up or he'd leave me a note and say he'd like to see me in his office. He wouldn't say, oh, I want to discuss so-and-so, or why did you come and see me in my office, you know, that kind of thing. And Dan had the reputation for being a brilliant editor because he never went anywhere and never did anything. He merely was a recipient of stuff that people brought into him, and showed very good judgment in what to run and what not to run. But I once wrote that I was around the village all the time doing my column, and I never, in all my 10 years doing the column, ever saw him at anything whatsoever. And so he was that kind of an editor. He was clever, and I must admit they did a good paper, and that way of editing as it happened with The Voice, was very successful. I don't knock the fact that I don't say that he wasn't a good editor. I'm merely pointing out this was his way of editing. It's not everybody's way of editing. After 10 years, when I'd done 500 and something columns, I used to run a picture at the top of my column, which first of all used to be the back of my head, and then I ran all kinds of little pictures I got from all over the place, ancient people and dead people and famous people and stuff, you know. And it was always called a column of lasting insignificance, on the grounds that what I wrote about was stuff that you would hear more about in the future, probably. And so I did a lot of these columns, did 500 and something columns, and then I I met a girl whom I really liked, called Sherry, and I made her agree that when I came back from Japan, we could go to those 25-cent photo machines, and she would do a 25-cent photo story for me. She said, well, I'll still do the thing if my boyfriend could come. And I said, of course, we'll all go along and do it. So the boyfriend was a guy called Walter Boart, and he said, oh, I'm starting a paper. It's called the East Village Other. And I said, oh, I'll do a column for you for nothing. He said, well, you're already doing a column. I said, no, I'll do a different column for you. I'll call it Art and Other Scenes. And the first column I did was about how forgery has always been a staple of art from the beginning of time. From the first artist, forgery was always like a really underpinning of art. So I did this column for Boart, and he knocked off the art and called it Other Scenes in the East Village Other. And after several issues of that, Ed called me and said, oh, I want to talk to you. And I went to his office and he said, you know, you can't write for another paper as well as the Village Voice. And I said, well, how about Nat Hentoff and all these other columns? Well, that's different. You can't write for that wretched paper in the East Village and write for the Village Voice. You're either going to have to choose. And I said, okay, I'll quit. I'll write for the East Village Other. And they said, are you sure you might want to come back? And I said, I will never want to come back. And I went over to the East Village Other. And Boart said, oh, okay, I'll make you editor. I think editing's a very interesting job because you really learn how to deal with words, and they're often not even your own words. I remember several injunctions that news editors made to me over the years. One of them was when I turned in a story to this guy on the Sheffield Telegraph where I first worked, and I gave him the story, and he looked at it and he started to ask questions. And I sort of stammered and couldn't answer the questions, and he calmly handed me the story back, and he said, never raise questions you can't answer. And I've always remembered that. And I've always remembered Mick Gang's advice. He was a New York Times magazine writer. He's written a lot of books about Lincoln. And he said to me, I always try to get motion into my stories. I always try to get them moving. So things like that I always remember. So he put on the masthead, edited by William Randolph Hearst and John Wilcott, right? So I edited several issues of the East Village Other, which was a crazy thing in itself, because they had this tiny office in the East Village, which had rats in it and cockroaches, and one guy there was Bill Beckman, who was the cartoonist. Anyway, so Bill Beckman was there over at the East Village Other, and Walter was sort of a bit paranoid, and he was going up to Millbrook a lot and turning on with acid a lot, which is something I'd already been through. And he did a brilliant cover one day, which was LBJ with a Nazi armband, and then he got stoned and he was paranoid. He was muttering, "I'm going to tear up that cover. I'm going to tear up that cover." So I surreptitiously went and photocopied it, and when he tore it up, and when he was not there the night we published, then I ran the cover. So I salvaged that. The East Village Other was a very visionary paper, because Voart realized that photo offset had not been widely used. The Voice had thought about printing photo offset very early, because where Ed came from, Middletown in upstate New York, they had an offset daily there. But Ed looked at it and decided that, what it meant was that the lines were skewed, they weren't always straight and everything. So they decided to go for the old-fashioned hot type way of printing. But Voart took a large piece of paper and realized that it didn't matter. You didn't have to be modular and linear, and you could put pictures and stuff anywhere and print it, just photocopy it basically, and it gave you a great deal of flexibility. Not to mention the fact that pictures came out much, much clearer rather than making blocks, Well, because I was very interested in Warhol, I was very interested when somebody I think it was Preston, went and did a review of the Chelsea Girls, and it was really stupid. It was a very uninformed, it wasn't just a put down, it was a very uninformed put down of the Chelsea Girls. So I said, you shouldn't run this, Walter, because it makes us look stupid, It makes us look like dumb, that we don't understand this, even though a lot of people that, think Warhol's a phony and all the rest of it. He said, well, I'm the publisher. I said, well, I'm supposed to be the editor. He said, well, I'm the publisher and I have the right to count him on anything. And I said, okay, forget it. I quit. So I quit. And both Voart and Preston hated Warhol for obvious reasons. Voart was an artist and didn't think Warhol was an artist. And Preston was a filmmaker and didn't think Warhol was a filmmaker. And so they were very antagonistic, and by this time I was hanging around the Warhol studio a lot. I had written about him for The Voice, and I was up there 2 or 3 times a week, and I was watching all the things going on. And I started going up there because Jonas Mekas, who had the Cinematheque, used to bug me to go along and see Warhol's movies, and I kept resisting and saying, it's such crap, all this shit at Cinematheque, bad movies and bad sound and no stories and so on. And it kept bugging me until one day, in desperation, I went to Cinematheque and I saw a Warhol movie, and I forget what it was, but it was kind of as terrible as all those early movies were. But what impressed me was the reaction of the audience, which was almost entirely antagonistic, screaming and yelling and booing, and I thought, well, anybody who could get people so annoyed, there's something going on there. And the sound was so bad that we thought maybe it might be deliberate, But anyway, I probably wouldn't have thought any more about it until I bumped into my friend around the art scene called Buddy Wirtschafter, who was like a real moocher, a really nice guy, who had the capacity to just crash anything. He, I guess, was the first person who instilled in me the idea that if you're in the art scene, then you're an artist and they've got no right to keep you out of anything, whether it's a big museum opening or what else. And the museums, although I'm sure they're not the same way, obviously were aware of this and felt, well, if they were going to ban people around the art scene all the time because they were artists, even though people were paying $100 and dressing up to go there, then, you know, they were in for a lot of criticism. So basically, you could crash everything. And so I got talking to Buddy, and I said I'd seen this Warhol movie, and he said, well, I'm the cameraman. He said, I'm Warhol's cameraman. He said, why don't you come along one day when we make a film? And I said, oh, what would I do? And he said, oh, you can hold the microphone or something, right? So we went over to Brooklyn Heights to Willard Moss's place, and Edie was doing the movie. And the one thing I remember most about it, apart from the fact the camera didn't move, as it didn't in those days, is that at one point, Edie got either so frustrated or so angry that she threw her drink and it hit the light and the light went out, and that was the end of the movie, right? So by this time I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. So I started going up to the factory a lot, and that was when they were on 49th Street, opposite the YMCA on 49th Street. And all those early days, I remember all kinds of discoveries, like, for example, was at a party. He was having a party once, and there was a television screen, and I was watching this television screen, and it was weird. It seemed to be playing the party, but it seemed to be playing the party as it was a few minutes ago, rather than now, you know. And I realized it was some kind of a tape delay, but it was new to me, all this stuff. And everything was silver, and silver paper everywhere, and the toilets painted silver, and everything, you know. And then I went up once, and they had decided to restrict access to some extent. You couldn't just walk in there. The door was locked. It was, as I remember, on the second floor. And so I went outside, and I saw that it was one of those typical New York fire escapes that you can pull down. So the next time I came, I brought a hooked umbrella, and I pulled it down, and I went up the fire escape and in through the window. And they were all amazed when they noticed I was there. Couldn't figure it out, but never made any attempt to stop me. And I was smoking a lot of dope in those days. There was never a day when I wasn't smoking dope. So almost everybody in the early movies got stoned on my dope, because I was usually the only person there with any. Edie was especially fond of getting a toke before she went on. So I feel that I was an influence on those early movies, because I got nearly everybody stoned in the first movies, you know. When the underground papers first started running sex, for example, the East Village Other realized the Village Voice would never run any ad with sex in it, so they started writing fake ones, like one was, "Keep me high and I'll ball you forever," signed Samantha, you know. And they started running sex ads, and after a while, as is always the case, certain crass commercial people came along and said, why on earth do we need all this offensive political stuff when we could just put out a sex paper alone and probably make a lot of money? So that's the big birth of all the sex papers, Screw and dozens of others. At the same time, the underground papers were financed very largely by record ads, most of which came from Columbia, Clive Davis in particular. Most of them were full-page ads, and all the underground papers would get one or two a week at $200, $300, $400 a page, and that's what financed the papers. So, as always happens crassly and commercially, people would come along like Jan Wenner and say, wow, we don't need all this offensive political stuff. We don't even need this offensive sex stuff, although it's nice to have. We don't need that. Why don't we just have the music stuff? So, lo and behold, CBS Records and all its other divisions, and Clive Davis in particular, went to the underground press and said, well, the reason why we're pulling music ads out of all the underground papers is, in future, we've decided just to concentrate on music-oriented papers, which meant Rolling Stone. It was obviously a cabal of Clive Davis and Jan Wenner behind it, although it was never revealed and stated as such. So the underground papers basically collapsed because two of its strong ingredients were taken out and made separate commercial entities. When Jim Buckley and Al Goldstein started Screw, there was a semi-underground paper whose name I forget in New York, and Jim had been working there, maybe Al too, And both of them went in the office one night when it was closed and put together the first issue of Screw, this sex paper, infuriating the guy who owned the paper. But the paper took off immediately and made millions and became, in effect, as you probably know, Screw was basically the hooker's Bible. It had all the ads from the hookers and pimps and all the rest in the back. In the same way as when High Times started, it had all the ads from the paraphernalia, drug dealer type stuff in the back. The underground press didn't like the idea of a sex paper. They didn't at that time see the significance of how this whole division had been hived off and made a separate entity that made money, and the sex ads didn't appear in the underground press anymore as much. They were much more annoyed by the way that the music ripped off the thing, because from the very beginning, Rolling Stone and crowd said, the music is the revolution, man, you know, as if it really was. So they were in two minds about sex paper. They believed in publicizing sex, in freedom of sex. They used it a lot politically to annoy the establishment rather than any stronger motive, but nevertheless they certainly were in favor of anything free being written about sex. I don't think they realized how important commercially it was going to become at the time. So they didn't have really strong opinions about the birth of these papers. It was only later they realized what inroads it made and how it had, to a large extent, corrupted the dialogue and lowered the tone of everything. And there were some papers that, on ideological grounds, refused to run all the growing number of sex ads that were then available, and so they couldn't. None of them could withstand the tide for long. And even the so-called respectable ones, like The Voice and so on, today have pages and pages of hooker ads at the back. In L.A., Art Kunkin put together the prototype of a paper that he thought would be good, inspired by the example of the Village Voice. Called me up, said he could run my column, which of course I said immediately. Put out an issue and took it to what was then a very new thing anywhere, but in L.A. it was called the Renaissance Fair, in which everybody went in costumes and postured, and it was the beginning of like public New Age demonstrations. So Kunkin had been a left-wing conspiracy theory linotype operator on some paper somewhere. Looks like Trotsky, a former New Yorker, I believe, and came out of that background, realized that there were, with the example of The Voice, that there was an opportunity for a paper like that in LA, and started the LA Free Press, which was very successful for a while and was around at a very pivotal time of history when there were the riots on Sunset Strip and Buffalo Springfield and Light My Fire with the Doors and the Being in San Francisco and all this stuff going on, all the ferment which he capitalized on very well. And before The Voice were Eamon Hennessy, who was an anarchist acolyte of Dorothy Day, who sold her penny Catholic worker around the streets, and Eamon Hennessy was one of the sellers for that. Somebody once accused Eamon Hennessy of being a communist, and he looked her right in the eye and said, "I'm worse than that, madam, I'm an anarchist." And so Eamon Hennessy's Dorothy Day's Catholic worker was the first, and then Lyle Stewart came along and started The Independent, which was an equally anti-establishment, querulous kind of funny tabloid. And then Paul Krasner, working for Lyle, spun off The Realist, which was the Bible to an awful lot of people I know for 10 years at least, 20 years. It was the thing they were brought up on. It was very skeptical about, particularly Catholicism, but all authorized opinions. It was querulous about and questioned and so on. Before that, before Paul, sometime around the early 50s, was Tuli Kupferberg, who was self-publishing, also anarchist-type stuff. And all this sort of came together around the beginning of the Voice years, which was 1955. October the 26th, 1955 was the first issue of the Village Voice. So the Voice had been around for 10 years before the underground papers started. And when we were sitting in the office of Evo, the underground paper in New York, the first one, which would be 1965, late 1965, we realized that Max Scher, who had been running a bar in Berkeley, had started the Berkeley Bar, which sold like crazy on the college streets of Berkeley, UC Berkeley. And Art Kunkin had started the LA Free Press, and some college kids had started the paper in Lansing, Michigan. In other words, there were 5 papers, so we contacted them all and formed the Underground Press Syndicate, the idea being we would all start papers, we would all swap each other's papers, use each other's material if we wanted to, and eventually enroll any paper that wanted to be a member of the Underground Press Syndicate. That contemporary history was the first period in history when young people actually had power. They had power and money, largely due to the fact that a lot of them had gone into being musicians when they were still in their early teens, made a lot of money, and thereby had power against the establishment. And they all smoked dope or were at least sympathetic to it. All over the world, and I traveled all over the world, and there were papers in Hong Kong, there were papers in Geneva, in Zurich, in Paris, in Germany, in Rome, in England, everywhere. There were underground papers, and they all shared in common 2 things. They all wanted to end the Vietnam War, and they all wanted to at least, if not legalize marijuana, at least decriminalize it. Those were 2 almost yardsticks that they all lived by. But they were all questioning, usually local. I think mine was probably the only international paper. And then there came a period when, quotes, democracy entered the scene, and a group of people putting out, say, for example, the Berkeley Bar would say, hey, this is not democratic. Max makes all the decisions. Max decides what's what. We're going to form a tribe, and we're going to, in future, sit around and discuss what's going into the paper and what's correct and what isn't. Politically correct had not yet entered the scene as a term, but nevertheless existed. Max Scher ran a bar called the Steppenwolf in Berkeley. Was always radically minded, was a bearded, not older guy, but not like a young kid like a lot of the underground press people were. He, being in Berkeley and all that ferment going on around him, like the free speech movement, he realized something was going on and sold his bar and started the paper, which traditionally is, renowned for having started on the kitchen table and being pasted together there. But he was very successful in putting sellers on the street, selling the thing for 25 cents, and I believe, whether it was just an inflated publishing claim as is traditional or not, at one time it was said to be selling 80,000 copies of the Berkeley Barb. He went for years with the Berkeley Barb, and it was a terrible layout. It was just all solid type almost, very little pictorial stuff in it, but fascinating and very much reflected the chaos of that Berkeley scene. Eventually that was where the Red Mountain tribe assembled itself and basically took over the paper, and the paper started to collapse from then onwards. Partly coincident with the fact that the underground press itself was then collapsing. It had passed its peak. I remember going to the first underground press syndicate conference, which was held in Stinson Beach, north of San Francisco. And we all went up there, and it was at the house of one of the guys who financed Woodstock, whose name I now forget. And we all assembled there, and it was the first time the underground press people had all met and been together. But at that underground press syndicate meeting, a lot of issues were straightened out, and a lot of common agreements were come to, and it was just kind of fascinating. I don't think there ever was another. There was just that one. After that, at one time, the underground press syndicate, there were 200 members all over the world, all swapping papers with each other and selling to the straight press subscriptions to all the papers together if they chose to pay the money to pay for that. So they were sort of kept informed in a second-hand way. And we always felt at the time, and many times expressed, the view that what we were dealing with today would be Times cover 2 years from now. Always very much into the implications of the future. And there were many ethical things considered. And among the ethical things considered jointly by the underground press was the idea that although it was a far-fetched idea, and although everybody felt kind of philosophically that to put LSD in the water supply and turn everybody on would be very beneficial, that would be an unethical thing to do, and that was where the line was drawn. But politically, everybody was on the left, although I don't think they would have defined it as such. They were mostly young people, so they weren't thinking in terms of socialists and communists and things like that. They were thinking in terms of them and us, the establishment and us, and them, the people that wanted to keep the war going. And when, as I told you, Walter Boart did a front page cover of LBJ with a Nazi armband, that was kind of the attitude of the times. But of course the local, you know, not the Hearst paper, but the Copley paper was certainly not running any of that. The underground papers were running that. And one of the criticisms made at the time was, well, that's all very well, you underground papers running this kind of stuff and this anti-Nixon accusations and so on, but there's no proof. We can't run things that as a respectable paper. And it made me think again of the seers and the prophets who, you know, who mouthed off about true things, but there was no evidence for. Because if you waited for the evidence, you'd never be able to print it. And even though it was true, you couldn't print it, basically. The underground press ignored all that and just printed it, you know. Whereas the left is built of all these people who are purer than thou. The Trotskyists fighting the Maoists, and everybody's got this true light, you know, and they're all fighting with each other, and they're all willing to kill each other rather than accept a joint agreement kind of thing, you know. And the chaos is what makes it, you know. I mean, this revolution, basically, it's people that are radical. They're radical in different ways, but because they're radical in different ways, they won't agree with each other. And so the very strength is a weakness. And a lot of the early papers, a lot of the early underground papers started out with a strong voice, usually one person, or at the most a couple of people who are in agreement, and put out this very strong vision, and put out a paper and they knew exactly what they were doing and what they believed in. And then at some point there were this namby-pamby crowd that would come along and say, this isn't democratic, you know, we've got to be a tribe here and vote on everything. And the papers fell apart. Happened over and over again with papers. It happened with the Berkeley Bar, who were taken over by the Red Mountain Tribe. It happened in a different way in New York with the RAG, which the Rat had become the RAG in New York, run by Jeff Shiro, which was taken over by a women's collective, and they basically killed the paper because it then became a feminist paper and not a general paper. So I saw that lesson over and over again. So yeah, chaos is good, chaos is bad. I was a long-time dope smoker. I knew in those days, even in the 60s, I knew that the idea of, well, maybe you have something there, well, we'll set up a group and inquire into it and research it. Even then I knew people had been smoking 10 years and nothing wrong with them. And I once said to somebody jokingly, I said, gee, you know, if only they were right and I hadn't smoked, supposing I'd never smoked dope, and, you know, and I've only managed to do like 38 books and 1,000 columns and 800 television shows, and I said, and the Witch's Almanac every year for 20 years. I said, God, if only I hadn't smoked, what I might have achieved, you know.
Artifacts is a free oral histories platform. Please like, subscribe, and visit our website, www.artifacts.movie, for an ad-free, interactive experience with bonus content. If you're able, please make a tax-deductible donation at www.artifacts.movie/donate. Hit the link on screen to watch another Artifacts interview.